Moses was not alive when God created the heavens and the earth. He was not there when light first appeared, when the seas gathered, when the first human being drew breath. Yet he wrote about all of it, in detail, with authority, and with a precision that has unsettled skeptics and strengthened believers for thousands of years. How is that possible? In this video, we will examine the man behind the writing, the sources he may have used, the role of divine revelation, and the archaeological and historical evidence that makes Genesis far more credible than its critics allow. There is a question that most readers of the Bible never stop to ask. It does not require any special background to formulate. No knowledge of Hebrew, no familiarity with ancient history, no theological vocabulary of any kind. It is the sort of question that a child could raise without fully realizing how far down it goes. And yet it is capable of producing a long silence even among people who have spent decades studying the Scriptures, because the question is both obvious and genuinely difficult. Moses was not present at the beginning of the world. He was not there when God separated light from darkness, when the waters gathered into seas, when dry land emerged and living creatures began to fill a world that had just come into existence. He was born thousands of years after those events took place. And yet Genesis, the book that records those moments in precise, authoritative language unlike anything else produced in the ancient Near East, bears his name as its author. So how exactly did he write it? The question is not peripheral. It does not live at the edges of biblical scholarship, waiting to catch the unprepared. It sits at the center of the text, and anyone who reads Genesis carefully and pauses to think about what they are actually reading will encounter it sooner or later. The answer shapes everything that follows, because the nature of Moses' authorship determines the nature of the text itself. If Moses was constructing a national mythology, the way the Babylonians shaped the Enuma Elish or the Egyptians composed their own accounts of how the world came to be, then Genesis is a document of cultural importance, but not of historical reliability. It would represent an ancient people's attempt to make sense of their origins, driven more by communal imagination than by any connection to actual events. But if Moses had genuine access to the information he recorded, through oral tradition carefully maintained across many generations, through written sources that had survived from earlier times, or through direct divine revelation, then Genesis belongs to a completely different order. It is not a human invention that happens to use sacred language. It is testimony. And testimony, unlike mythology, carries a kind of historical weight that imagination simply cannot produce. That distinction reaches much further than most people allow. Genesis is not a preamble that can be quietly set aside without consequences. Every foundational pillar of Christian belief has its origin there. The nature of God, the creation of human beings in His image, the entry of sin and death into the world, the earliest indication that redemption was not merely a future possibility, but a divine intention already in motion. The rest of Scripture does not simply follow from Genesis. In a very real sense, it is a long elaboration of what those first chapters put in place. If that foundation is uncertain, everything built above it is exposed. This is not a theoretical discussion. When critics challenge the historical credibility of Genesis, they are not raising a narrow objection about one ancient text. They are targeting something structural, something that, if removed, creates real problems throughout the entire theological framework. That is why it cannot be handled with a vague appeal to allegory or a dismissive reference to the limits of ancient knowledge. It deserves a real answer. Finding that answer does not require setting aside intellectual honesty. It requires engaging with the available evidence, historical, literary, archaeological, and theological. without filtering it through conclusions reached before the inquiry even began. And as this video will explore, that evidence is considerably more substantial than the standard skeptical narrative tends to acknowledge. Moses was not an eyewitness to creation. Everyone agrees on that. But the explanation for how he came to write about it is not a matter of guesswork. There are coherent, historically grounded answers, and understanding them does not diminish faith. If anything, it gives faith something more reliable to stand on. Not a leap into the unknown, but a step onto ground that has been carefully examined and found solid. Moses was born into a world designed to erase him. The opening chapters of Exodus describe Egypt at the height of its imperial confidence and Israel in a condition of enforced servitude. The Hebrews were building cities under the direction of taskmasters who answered to a pharaoh who had decided, with cold political logic, that a growing slave population was a demographic threat. His solution included an order for the death of every male Hebrew infant. Moses survived through circumstances that the text narrates with unusual calm. His mother hid him for 3 months. When concealment became impossible, she placed him in a basket sealed with pitch and papyrus and set it among the reeds of the Nile. There, Pharaoh's own daughter found him, understood immediately that he was a Hebrew child, and chose to raise him as her own. The man who would one day write the earliest chapters of human history was rescued from death by the family of the very ruler who had ordered his execution. Growing up inside the Egyptian royal household meant something very specific in the ancient world. Egypt in that period was not simply powerful. It was literate, organized, and intellectually sophisticated in ways most other societies were not. The training given to scribes and officials in the royal court involved years of structured instruction, reading and writing in multiple scripts, mathematics, legal reasoning, astronomical observation, and the careful interpretation of both religious and historical texts. To belong to that world was to understand, from an early age, that events deserved to be recorded, and that written words outlasted spoken ones. In Acts 7, when Stephen stands before the Jewish council and delivers his account of Israel's history, he describes Moses as having been educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, powerful in both speech and action. This is not rhetorical praise. It is a description of a man formed by one of the most intellectually demanding environments of the ancient world. This matters enormously for the question of Genesis, the ability to write, and more than that, the habit of writing, the conviction that history should be preserved, was something Moses carried with him long before he received any divine commission. He had been shaped into someone capable of producing a written text of lasting significance before the desert, before the burning bush, before any of it. After killing an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave, Moses fled. 40 years in one of the most powerful courts in history gave way to 40 years as a shepherd in the desert of Midian, working for a man named Jethro. By any ordinary measure, it looks as though the story is over. The promising life has collapsed. The prince is gone. But the text does not treat those years as wasted. The desert did something to Moses that the palace never could have done. It stripped him of status, comfort, and the confidence that comes from position rather than character. It gave him silence, physical work, and an extended encounter with his own limitations. Whatever sense of self-sufficiency the Egyptian court had built into him, Midian spent 4 decades quietly dismantling it. The pattern appears repeatedly in the biblical narrative. Joseph endured years in prison before he stood before Pharaoh. David spent long stretches hiding in caves before he became king. Paul withdrew to the desert after his conversion before beginning his public ministry. In each case, The preparation came not through achievement, but through obscurity. Moses was no exception. It was in that desert, not in any temple or throne room, that God appeared to Moses in a fire that burned without consuming the bush it surrounded. The account in Exodus 3 is precise and unhurried. Moses turns aside to look. God calls him by name. Moses answers, and what follows changes the direction of everything. The commission Moses receives there is the frame around every action he will take for the rest of his life. He is sent back to Egypt not as a man seeking personal vindication, but as the representative of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is given a name, I am who I am, that contains within it an entire theology of divine existence, one that distinguishes Israel's God from every deity in Egypt's long religious tradition. For our purposes, what matters is this. The man who returns to Egypt after that encounter is not simply a well-educated former prince with literary skills. He is someone who has entered into direct communication with the God who was present before the first day of creation. And that changes the question of how Moses wrote Genesis in a way no academic theory alone could ever explain. One of the more straightforward places to begin this investigation is inside the biblical text itself, before looking to external evidence. Archaeology, comparative literature, ancient Near Eastern history. It is worth asking what the Bible actually says about Moses as a writer, because the answer is more direct than many readers realize. Throughout the books of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, there are repeated references to Moses writing things down. These are not incidental details inserted to give the text a sense of authenticity. They appear at significant moments, often immediately after major events or divine communications, as if the act of recording was understood to be part of the commission itself. In Exodus 17, after the defeat of the Amalekites, God instructs Moses to write a record of what had happened as a memorial and to make sure that Joshua heard it. In Exodus 24, following the giving of the covenant at Sinai, the text states that Moses wrote down everything the Lord had said. Numbers 33 contains a detailed itinerary of the Israelites' journey through the desert, and the text is explicit that Moses recorded each stage at the Lord's command. By the time the reader reaches Deuteronomy, Moses is portrayed not just as someone who occasionally wrote things down, but as someone who completed an entire written document. Deuteronomy 31 records that Moses finished writing the words of this law in a book and gave it to the Levites, to be placed beside the Ark of the Covenant. These references do not prove that Moses wrote Genesis in isolation, but they establish beyond reasonable doubt that Moses was a writer, that writing was a recognized part of his role, and that the people around him understood his words to carry permanent, documentary weight. The most theologically significant witness to Mosaic authorship is not found in the Old Testament. It is found in the words of Jesus himself, recorded across multiple points in the Gospel accounts. In John 5, Jesus is engaged in a dispute with Jewish religious leaders who claimed to honor God while rejecting the one God had sent. His response moves the argument in an unexpected direction. He tells them that if they truly believed Moses, they would believe him, because Moses wrote about him. The implication is clear. The writings of Moses carry genuine prophetic and historical content directly relevant to the identity of Jesus. He is not speaking about Moses as a legendary figure whose name had been attached to ancient texts over centuries of tradition. He speaks as someone who treats those writings as the actual work of a real historical person. In Luke 24, after the resurrection, Jesus walks with two disciples on the road to Emmaus without revealing who he is. He listens as they describe their confusion and disappointment, and then the text records that beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Moses is treated here as the first point in a continuous line of authoritative revelation. One could argue that Jesus was simply accommodating the popular belief of his time without endorsing it. But that argument requires assigning to Jesus a level of rhetorical dishonesty that sits uneasily with everything else the Gospels present about his character. He corrected popular assumptions regularly and without hesitation when those assumptions were wrong. The consistent and unreflective way he referenced the writings of Moses as Moses' writings suggests genuine conviction rather than cultural courtesy. Jesus was not the only voice in the New Testament to treat Mosaic authorship as an established reality. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Rome, quotes from Genesis and Deuteronomy without distinguishing between them in terms of origin or authority. In 2 Corinthians thus 3, he refers to the reading of Moses in the synagogue as something still practiced in his own time, a description that assumes both the existence of a distinct Mosaic corpus and its continued liturgical use. John's Gospel opens with a direct comparison between the giving of the law through Moses and the coming of grace and truth through Jesus Christ, presenting Moses not as a symbolic figure, but as the historical agent of a specific and foundational event. Throughout the New Testament, the phrase Moses said or Moses wrote appears in contexts where the speaker is clearly attributing real authorship to a real person. This consistency is not coincidental. It reflects a shared understanding that carried across very different writers, writing in different circumstances to different audiences. None of them treats the Mosaic authorship of the Torah as a contested or uncertain matter. Long before Christianity had developed any formal position on the question, the Jewish tradition had already settled it. For the rabbinical tradition, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy was not just a collection of ancient writings that had been assembled over time. It was the direct written legacy of Moses, delivered through him by God, and it occupied a category entirely distinct from the other sacred writings. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, described Moses as the author of the 5 books and treated that attribution as something no serious person in his tradition would question. The Talmud, compiled centuries later, preserves the same understanding, with later additions attributed to Joshua or to subsequent scribes noted explicitly as exceptions, which only reinforces the assumption that the default authorship was Mosaic. This matters for the question of Genesis specifically, because the Jewish tradition never separated the first book from the rest of the Torah. Genesis was not treated as an orphan text of uncertain origin that had been later attached to the Mosaic collection. It was understood as the opening of a unified literary and theological work that Moses had received and recorded. The tradition that preserved these texts across millennia was not ambiguous about where they came from. It is easy in a modern context to take writing for granted. Words are everywhere, on screens, on packaging, on the walls of every building. But for most of human history, the ability to write was rare, carefully guarded, and closely associated with institutional power. The person who could record information controlled how that information was remembered and transmitted. Writing was not a neutral skill. It was a form of authority. Egypt understood this better than almost any other civilization of the ancient world. By the time Moses was born, the Egyptians had been developing and refining written language for well over 2,000 years. Their oldest script, hieroglyphics, was a complex system combining phonetic signs, ideograms, and determinatives that required years of dedicated study to master. Alongside it existed a simplified cursive form known as hieratic, used for administrative documents, religious texts and personal correspondence. The writing surfaces varied: stone monuments, papyrus scrolls, limestone flakes, wooden boards covered with plaster. The infrastructure of written communication in Egypt was extensive, and it operated at every level of government and religious life. To be educated in the royal court meant, above all else, to be trained in this system. The scribal schools attached to the palace and the temple complexes were among the most disciplined educational institutions of the ancient world. Students spent years copying texts, learning formulas, and developing the fine motor precision that complex scripts demand. By the time they completed their training, they were not simply literate in the modern sense. They were custodians of an entire written tradition spanning centuries of accumulated knowledge. The curriculum inside an Egyptian scribal school was not limited to language. Mathematics was taught through practical problems, calculating the volume of grain stores, determining the slope of a pyramid, distributing rations among a workforce. Astronomy was studied because the agricultural calendar depended on the movement of stars. Legal reasoning was part of the training, because the administration of justice required the ability to interpret written precedent and compose binding documents. Beyond the technical disciplines, students were exposed to a literary tradition that included religious hymns, wisdom literature, historical narratives, and cosmological texts describing the origin of the world and the nature of the gods. The Egyptians produced a considerable body of writing about creation. The Memphite Theology, preserved on the Shabaka stone, describes how the god Ptah created all things through the power of thought and speech. The Hermopolitan tradition offered a different cosmological model. These were not casual folk traditions. They were carefully composed and formally preserved texts that students in the royal system were expected to know. A man raised in that environment would have grown up with a natural fluency in the idea that origins could be written about, that cosmological questions were legitimate subjects for written investigation, and that authoritative answers deserved permanent textual form. When Moses eventually wrote about the creation of the world, he was operating within a cultural framework that recognized such writing as meaningful and serious. The novelty of Genesis was not that it addressed these questions. The novelty was the answers it gave. Egypt was not alone in its commitment to written documentation. Across the ancient Near East, cultures maintained a remarkably consistent practice of recording genealogies, king lists, and accounts of cosmic origins. Mesopotamia produced the Sumerian king list, which traces royal succession across enormous spans of time. The Babylonians compiled detailed records of lineages connecting present rulers to legendary ancestors. In Ugarit, scribes recorded mythological narratives that mixed divine genealogy with cosmological explanation. Genealogical records were not simply matters of family pride. They were instruments of legitimacy, identity, and theological interpretation. This context is directly relevant to Genesis, because the book is structured around genealogies in a way that would have been immediately recognizable to any educated reader in the ancient world. The repeated phrase that marks each new section, "These are the generations of," signals to the reader that what follows is a formal record of origins and descendants, precisely the kind of document that ancient scribal culture valued, preserved, and transmitted with care. Moses did not invent this form. He worked within it and filled it with content unlike anything produced anywhere else. Placing Genesis alongside other ancient cosmological texts reveals something worth examining carefully. The parallels are real but limited. Several ancient Near Eastern cultures produced accounts of a great flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest literary works ever discovered, contains a flood narrative that shares structural similarities with the account in Genesis. A divinely warned survivor, a boat, the release of birds, a landing on a mountain. Similar stories appear in Sumerian and Akkadian sources. These parallels have been used by some scholars to argue that Genesis is simply a reworking of older Mesopotamian material, that Moses, or whoever wrote the text, borrowed from these traditions and gave them a Hebrew theological coating, but the argument tends to collapse under close examination. The similarities are largely structural. The differences are profound and systematic. In the Mesopotamian flood accounts, the gods are impulsive, divided, and frequently capricious. The flood is sent not out of moral judgment, but out of divine irritation at human noise. The survivor is saved almost by accident, through the intervention of a single deity acting against the wishes of others. In Genesis, the logic is entirely different. One God acts with sovereign consistency. The flood is a moral response to genuine corruption. The survivor is chosen deliberately and preserved as the beginning of a renewed relationship between God and humanity. The theological framework is not merely different in tone. It operates on different premises entirely. Whatever Moses knew of the stories circulating in the wider ancient world, what he wrote was not a borrowing. It was a correction. Modern readers tend to underestimate what oral tradition could accomplish in the ancient world. In a culture shaped by writing, memory is treated as a fallible and secondary faculty, a temporary holding space until something can be recorded. But in societies where writing was either unavailable or restricted to a small literate class, memory was something else entirely. It was a discipline. It was practiced, structured, and transmitted with a precision that most people in the contemporary world would find difficult to imagine. Ancient Near Eastern cultures developed sophisticated methods for preserving historical and religious content across generations. Narratives were not simply recounted casually around fires. They were maintained through structured repetition, rhythmic formulas, and communal recitation that made deviation from the established form immediately noticeable. Griots in West African oral traditions, for example, could reproduce genealogies and historical accounts spanning centuries with a reliability that surprised early Western scholars who assumed such accuracy was impossible without documentation. The same instinct operated across the ancient world in different forms. For the patriarchal families of Genesis, oral preservation was not a last resort. It was the primary technology of cultural memory. The stories of creation, the fall, the flood, and the early generations were not incidental tales. They were the identity of the people who carried them. The incentive to preserve them accurately was not merely sentimental. It was existential. These were the accounts that explained who they were, where they came from, and what kind of God they belonged to. Genesis is not a loosely assembled collection of ancient stories. It has a deliberate internal structure, and that structure reveals something important about the nature of the sources Moses may have drawn upon. Running through the book is a repeated literary formula in Hebrew, Ele Toledot, which translates roughly as, "These are the generations of," or "This is the account of." The phrase appears 11 times across Genesis, each time introducing a new section focused on a specific figure or family line. The heavens and the earth, Adam, Noah, the sons of Noah, Shem, Terah, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, and Jacob. Each introduction marks a formal transition, as if the text is moving from one source document to the next. Scholars who have studied the literary structure of Genesis carefully have noted that this pattern is consistent with the kind of document division that would appear in a text compiled from multiple written sources, each one beginning with a formal heading identifying its subject. The Toledot formula functions not as a narrative decoration, but as an archival marker. It tells the reader this section belongs to this record. What follows comes from this line of testimony. This observation points towards something significant. Genesis may not have been composed entirely from scratch by Moses in the desert. It may represent, at least in part, the careful editing and arrangement of records that already existed. Records that Moses, with his scribal training, was uniquely equipped to handle. In the 1930s, a British scholar and military officer named P.J. Wiseman proposed a reading of Genesis that drew on his knowledge of Mesopotamian archaeology and ancient scribal conventions. His argument was specific and textual. He suggested that the Toledot phrases in Genesis did not introduce new sections. They concluded them. In other words, each formula was not a title at the beginning of a unit, but a colophon at the end, a scribal notation identifying the author or custodian of the preceding material, exactly as such notations appeared on ancient clay tablets from Mesopotamia. Clay tablets of the period typically ended with a line identifying who had written or owned the tablet, and sometimes when and where. Wiseman argued that the same convention was operating in Genesis. These are the generations of Noah. On this reading, would not be introducing what follows, but concluding what preceded, signaling that the foregoing account belonged to the records of Noah's family. The implication of this reading is striking. It suggests that Genesis was compiled from a series of real written records, each maintained by the family it described, passed down across generations, and eventually brought together, very possibly during the period when Jacob's family lived in Egypt, where Joseph had both the connections and the resources to gather such documents, and where the scribal culture would have given them proper archival form. Moses, arriving generations later in that same environment, may have received not just oral tradition but actual tablets. Wiseman's hypothesis has been developed further by his son Donald Wiseman, himself a distinguished Assyriologist, and by others including the scholar R.K. Harrison. It remains a minority position but a serious one, supported by a detailed knowledge of how scribal culture actually functioned in the ancient Near East. One of the most compelling observations about Genesis is how few generational links separate the earliest figures in the book from Moses himself. Given the extraordinary lifespans recorded in the early chapters, the chain of transmission is considerably shorter than most people assume. Adam, according to the genealogy in Genesis 5, lived for 930 years. His lifespan overlapped with that of Lamech, Noah's father, by more than a century. Noah himself lived 950 years. When the ages begin to shorten after the flood, the figures are still substantial. Shem, one of Noah's sons, lived 500 years, long enough to have been alive during Abraham's lifetime. Abraham's lifespan overlapped with that of Isaac, who overlapped with Jacob, who lived to see Joseph rise to power in Egypt. The practical consequence of these numbers is that the oral chain connecting the events of Genesis to its eventual written form may have passed through remarkably few hands. If the genealogical figures are taken at face value, it is possible that the account of the flood reached Abraham through a relatively direct line of transmission, and that Abraham carried knowledge of creation and the earliest generations into the patriarchal period. Joseph, who arrived in Egypt several generations later, stood in a direct line of transmission from those events. Moses, raised in the very country where Joseph had preserved his family, had access to that inheritance. The question sounds like it should have an enormous answer. Creation, after all, feels impossibly remote from the time of Moses. But when the genealogies of Genesis are followed carefully, the generational distance is surprisingly compact. From Adam to Noah is 10 generations. From Noah to Abraham is another 10. From Abraham to Moses through Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Kohath, and Amram is 5 more. The total is roughly 25 generations separating Moses from the first human being the Bible names. For comparison, 25 generations in a modern population at an average of 25 to 30 years per generation would reach back approximately 600 to 700 years. In a world of extended lifespans and overlapping generations, where direct transmission was possible between figures who had known each other personally, that chain is not long. It is, in fact, short enough that Moses could theoretically have been only a few steps removed from men who had spoken directly with people present at the earliest events of the human story. This does not resolve every question about how Moses wrote what he wrote, but it does shift the framework of the question considerably. The gap between Moses and the beginning of Genesis is not an unbridgeable chasm of forgotten time. It is a structured sequence of transmissible knowledge, carried forward by people whose extraordinary longevity made the chain of custody far more direct than it first appears. Every answer explored so far, oral tradition, ancient records, genealogical chains, scribal training, operates within the boundaries of what human beings can reasonably transmit to one another. Across time, they are credible explanations supported by historical and literary evidence, and they go a considerable distance toward accounting for how Moses could have written about events that preceded him by many generations. But they do not go all the way. There is a category of content in Genesis that no oral tradition could have preserved, because no human being was present to witness it. The internal dialogue of God before creation, the moment when light separated from darkness before any living eye existed to observe it, the words spoken between God and Adam before any other person was alive to hear them. These are not events for which eyewitness testimony could have passed through any chain of transmission, however short. They belong to a different order of knowledge entirely. This is precisely where the biblical concept of inspiration becomes not merely relevant, but necessary. The claim the Bible makes about its own origins is not that its human authors were exceptionally intelligent or exceptionally well informed. It is that they wrote under the active influence of God's Spirit in a way that made their words carry divine authority alongside their human character. The second letter of Peter states this plainly. Addressing the question of how prophetic scripture came to exist, the text says that no prophecy ever came from human will, but that people spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. The word translated carried along is the same word used elsewhere to describe a ship moved by the wind. Not overridden, not replaced, but directed by a force beyond itself. The human writer remained a genuine author. The content, however, came from somewhere the writer alone could never have reached. One of the consistent patterns running through the entire biblical narrative is that God communicates with His chosen messengers through means that bypass the normal channels of human knowledge. This is not presented as an exceptional or puzzling feature of the biblical story. It is treated as the standard method by which divine information enters human history. The patriarch Jacob received a vision of a ladder connecting earth and heaven, with God speaking to him directly from above it. Joseph, his son, interpreted dreams with an accuracy that the text attributes not to exceptional psychological insight, but to a gift given by God. The prophet Ezekiel described visions of extraordinary complexity, wheels within wheels, living creatures, a valley of dry bones returning to life, that came to him unbidden and uninvited. revealing realities he could not have constructed from personal experience. The prophet Isaiah received a vision of the heavenly throne room that he then recorded with compositional precision. In each case, the pattern is the same. A human being encounters content that originates outside the boundaries of ordinary human cognition. They receive it, they record it, and the text presents this process not as a supernatural anomaly requiring special justification, but as a natural extension of the relationship between God and the people through whom he chooses to speak. For Moses to have received knowledge of creation through direct divine revelation would not, within this framework, represent anything structurally different from what other biblical writers experienced. It would simply mean that God disclosed to him what only God could know. The events of the first days of the world. In the same way that he disclosed to Ezekiel what only God could see, and to Daniel what only God could foresee. The category was already well established. Within the biblical portrayal of prophetic experience, Moses occupies a position that the text itself marks as singular. Most prophets received communication through visions or dreams. Indirect encounters in which God's presence was mediated through symbols, images, or voices heard in altered states. Moses was different. Numbers 12 addresses this distinction directly, in a context where Miriam and Aaron have challenged Moses' authority. God's response is not to defend Moses' character or his history of faithful service. It is to clarify the nature of the communication Moses received. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles, the text records. He sees the form of the Lord. The implication is that Moses had access to a kind and quality of divine communication that placed him in a category apart from every other prophet who came before or after. Deuteronomy 34, the closing chapter of the Torah, reinforces this in its eulogy for Moses. It states that no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. This is not simply a tribute to a great leader. It is a theological statement about the unique epistemic access Moses possessed. He was not someone who received occasional messages from a distant God. He was someone who knew God with a directness that distinguished him from every other human figure in the biblical narrative. If that characterization is accurate, then the question of how Moses wrote about creation takes on a different texture. It is not primarily a question about sources, chains of transmission, or scribal training, though all of those remain relevant. It is a question about what a man who spoke with God face to face might have been shown. And the answer, within the logic of the biblical text, is that such a man could have been shown anything. Creation, by definition, had no human audience. The first chapter of Genesis describes events that occurred before human beings existed. Whatever Moses wrote about those events could not have come from human testimony, however well preserved. It required a source with direct knowledge of what happened, which means it required God. This is not an argument from desperation, offered when all other explanations run out. It is the argument the biblical text itself makes as its primary claim. The opening verse of Genesis does not present itself as the beginning of a mythological tradition, or the distillation of ancient oral memory. It presents itself as a statement of fact about ultimate origins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That sentence does not have the tone of transmitted legend. It has the tone of authoritative disclosure. The information in Genesis 1 and 2 is not the kind of information that accumulates through observation. No amount of looking at the night sky tells an ancient shepherd that light existed before the sun did, or that the sequence of creation moved from formless void to ordered complexity through a series of deliberate, divine acts. Those are claims that require a source beyond human investigation. The text claims to have exactly that source. The book of Genesis is not the only place in Scripture where a writer records events that no human being could have observed directly. The pattern appears elsewhere in ways that make the principle easier to recognize. The book of Job contains a scene set entirely in the heavenly realm, a conversation between God and the adversary, conducted before any human observer. The reader of Job knows what happened in that exchange. Job himself never did. Whoever compiled the book had access to content that could only have come through revelation, because there was no human witness to that conversation who could have passed it down. The book of Revelation presents John with visions of future events, heavenly realities, and cosmic judgments that exist beyond the reach of any historical memory or natural human perception. The content of those visions was given to him, not discovered by him. He wrote what he was shown. In both cases, the text operates on the same assumption that underlies Moses' account of creation, that God can disclose to a human writer what that writer has no natural means of knowing. The mechanism is consistent. The precedent is well established across both testaments, and when that principle is applied to the question of how Moses wrote Genesis, the answer it produces is neither evasive nor implausible. It is simply the claim the Bible makes about itself, that its most foundational content did not originate in human memory, but in divine disclosure. Anyone who reads Genesis alongside the creation accounts of neighboring ancient cultures will notice something. Immediately, the differences are not subtle. They are structural, theological, and in several respects almost confrontational. As if the text was composed with deliberate awareness of what other traditions claimed and had decided to say something fundamentally different. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, opens with a conflict between divine beings. The world does not come into existence as an act of intentional design. It emerges as a byproduct of cosmic violence. Shu, the body of the slain goddess Tiamat, is split apart by the god Marduk, and from her remains he fashions the heavens and the earth. Human beings are created as an afterthought, shaped from the blood of a defeated deity, for the sole purpose of relieving the gods of manual labor. In the Egyptian tradition, creation narratives varied across different theological centers, but they shared a common feature. The gods themselves were embedded within the created order. They were born from primordial matter. They struggled for supremacy. They needed food and sustenance. They could be deceived. The divine was not categorically separate from the material world. It was continuous with it. Genesis operates on entirely different premises. There is one God. He is not produced by anything that precedes him. He does not struggle. He does not need assistance. He speaks, and what he speaks comes into existence. The world is not the residue of a divine conflict. It is the product of sovereign intention. And when human beings appear at the end of the sixth day, they are not created as slaves for a tired deity. They are made in the image of God. A phrase that carries within it an entire anthropology that no other ancient text comes close to, articulating. The contrast is not incidental. It suggests that Genesis was not borrowing from the mythological traditions of its neighbors. It was answering them. The literary architecture of Genesis 1 is one of the most discussed structural features in biblical scholarship, and for good reason. The seven-day framework is not simply a convenient narrative device. It is a carefully constructed pattern that encodes meaning at multiple levels simultaneously. The 6 days of creation divide naturally into 2 parallel panels of 3 days each. In the first 3 days, God forms the environments, light and darkness, sky and sea, dry land and vegetation. In the second 3 days, he fills those environments. Luminaries to govern light and darkness, birds and sea creatures to fill sky and sea, land animals and human beings to inhabit the earth. The correspondence between the two panels is precise and symmetrical. Day 1 parallels day 4, day 2 parallels day 5, day 3 parallels day 6. This is not the structure of a casual story passed down around campfires. It is the structure of a composed text, organized with architectural intentionality. Ancient Hebrew literature used numerical patterns, particularly the number 7, as markers of completeness and divine order. 7 appears throughout the creation account in ways that go beyond the obvious. The first sentence of Genesis in Hebrew consists of 7 words. The second sentence has 14. The word God appears 35 times in the chapter. The word earth appears 21 times. These are not coincidences. They are the fingerprints of an author working with deliberate precision in a tradition where numerical composition was a recognized literary technique. The seventh day, the day of rest, functions not as an anticlimax, but as the theological destination of the entire sequence. The creation is complete not when the last creature is formed, but when God rests. When the work is set apart, declared finished and blessed, that detail would shape the entire Israelite understanding of time, work, and the meaning of the Sabbath for centuries to come. This is territory that requires careful handling. Genesis is not a science textbook, and reading it as one produces distortions in both directions. Either forcing the text to say more than it intends, or dismissing it because it does not use the vocabulary of modern physics. But there are points at which the general description offered by Genesis aligns with conclusions that science reached only much later, and those alignments are worth noting without overstating them. The sequence of creation in Genesis 1, from formless matter to light, to the separation of water and land, to plant life, to animal life, to human beings, broadly corresponds to the sequence that cosmology and biology have reconstructed through independent means. The text does not describe a world that simply appeared fully formed. It describes a process, moving from the simple to the complex, from the uninhabitable to the inhabited. That ordering was not obvious to ancient readers. Several other ancient cosmologies described things appearing in entirely different sequences, or all at once. The description of the universe beginning in a formless, dark, undifferentiated state, and the first divine act being the introduction of light, carries an unexpected resonance with modern cosmological models in which the early universe was an opaque plasma through which light could not travel freely until conditions changed. Again, this is not a claim that Genesis was anticipating quantum physics. It is an observation that the text described a beginning that later investigation found difficult to contradict. Perhaps most striking is the claim that human life came last in the sequence of creation, after the formation of every other living system. That ordering, which would have seemed arbitrary to most ancient cultures, who placed humans at the center of everything from the beginning, matches the sequence the fossil record eventually revealed. The name given to the first human being in Genesis is not simply a proper name in the way that modern names function. In Hebrew, Adam is a common noun that means human being or humanity. It shares its root with Adamah, which means ground or earth. The wordplay is deliberate and theologically loaded. The creature called Adam is the one taken from the Adamah, formed from the soil, constitutively connected to the earth from which it was drawn. This linguistic connection encodes a statement about human nature that runs throughout the rest of the Bible. Human beings are not divine beings who have descended into matter. They are creatures, beings who belong to the created order and are sustained by it. The ground that grows their food is the same substance from which they were made. Genesis 3 makes this explicit when God tells Adam that he will return to the ground from which he came. For dust he is, and to dust he will return. At the same time, the text holds this earthly origin in tension with something else. This creature made from soil is also made in the image of God, a phrase that distinguishes human beings from every other creature in the creation account. No other living thing receives that designation. The tension between Adamah and Imago Dei, between dust and divine image, is not a contradiction to be resolved. It is the central paradox of human existence that the rest of Scripture spends considerable effort exploring. The image of a serpent associated with wisdom, deception, or forbidden knowledge appears across a remarkable range of ancient cultures, and scholars have spent considerable energy mapping these connections. In Mesopotamian tradition, the serpent appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh as the creature that steals the plant of immortality from the hero while he sleeps. In Egyptian iconography, serpents were associated with both destructive chaos and protective divine power. In ancient Canaanite religion, serpents carried connotations of fertility and hidden knowledge. These parallels are real, but their significance is often misread. The existence of a serpent in Genesis does not indicate that the biblical account borrowed from neighboring traditions. It indicates that the serpent was a widely recognized symbol in the ancient world, and that Genesis engaged with that symbol on its own terms. What Genesis does with the serpent is notably different from what other traditions do. The creature in Genesis 3 is not a god, not a divine adversary of equal power, and not a symbol of fertility. It is a creature, one of the animals God had made, identified as more cunning than any other. Its authority is derivative and limited, and the damage it does in the narrative is not cosmic warfare. It is the corruption of a relationship, achieved not through force, but through a question. Did God actually say? The mechanism of the fall in Genesis, a subtle distortion of a divine word, leading to a choice, leading to consequence, is psychologically and theologically precise in a way that distinguishes it sharply from the dramatic mythological conflicts of other ancient traditions. The flood narrative of Genesis and the flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh have been compared since the Gilgamesh tablets were first translated in the 19th century, and the structural parallels are striking enough that they cannot simply be ignored. In both accounts, a single man receives a divine warning of an impending flood. He is instructed to build a large vessel. He brings animals aboard. The flood comes. After the waters recede, he releases birds to test whether dry land is accessible. He offers a sacrifice when the ordeal is over. Those similarities have led some scholars to conclude that Genesis is simply a Hebrew adaptation of the Mesopotamian story, stripped of its polytheistic framework and retold within a monotheistic one. But this reading underestimates how deeply the two accounts differ in the things that matter most. In the Gilgamesh epic, the gods send the flood because humanity has become too noisy. The decision is impulsive and contested. The god Enlil wants to destroy humanity, but the god Ea warns the survivor Utnapishtim in secret, acting against Enlil's intentions. After the flood, the gods gather like flies around the sacrifice because they have been starving without human offerings to sustain them. The survivor is granted immortality somewhat arbitrarily, more to resolve an awkward situation than to fulfill any larger purpose. None of that logic exists in Genesis. God sends the flood because the earth is full of violence and moral corruption. There is no divine counsel in conflict. There is no secret warning given against another deity's wishes. Noah is chosen because he was righteous in his generation. A morally grounded selection, not an accidental one, and the covenant God establishes with Noah afterward is not an improvised response to a near disaster. It is a deliberate act of commitment, sealed with a sign, expressing an intention that shapes the rest of biblical history. The similarities between the two accounts most likely reflect a common memory of a catastrophic ancient flood, an event significant enough to leave its imprint across multiple cultural traditions. What they do not reflect is literary dependence. The theological architecture of Genesis and the Gilgamesh epic are built on foundations so different that they could not have come from the same source. One inherited a story and transformed it beyond recognition, or one recorded what actually happened, and the other preserved a distorted echo of the same event. In the 19th century, a group of German biblical scholars developed what became known as the documentary hypothesis, a theory about the origins of the Pentateuch that would go on to dominate academic biblical studies for well over a century. The theory's most influential formulation came from Julius Wellhausen in 1878, and its core claim was straightforward. The 5 books attributed to Moses were not written by Moses at all. They were compiled from 4 distinct source documents, produced by different authors at different times, and stitched together by a later editor into the text that now exists. Each source was assigned a letter. J designated a source that used the divine name Yahweh. E designated one that preferred the name Elohim. D referred to material associated with Deuteronomy. P identified a priestly source concerned with legal and ritual matters. These 4 streams, the theory proposed, were gradually combined over several centuries, reaching their final form sometime after the Babylonian exile, which would place the composition of Genesis roughly 1,000 years after the events of Moses' life. The theory had considerable influence, and traces of it remain present in academic biblical scholarship today. But it has also faced sustained and serious criticism from multiple directions, and its original confidence has eroded considerably since its peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One fundamental problem is circular reasoning, the criteria used to identify the different sources. Variations in divine names, shifts in vocabulary, apparent repetitions were determined in advance by assumptions about what the text should look like if it were a unified composition. When the text did not meet those expectations, the explanation was that a seam between sources had been found. But the same features that the hypothesis treated as evidence of multiple authorship are found routinely in ancient literature produced by single authors. Homer's Iliad contains repetitions and vocabulary shifts. Ancient Near Eastern legal texts use varying divine names without implying multiple authorship. The assumption that a skilled ancient writer would never repeat himself or vary his vocabulary was a modern, literary expectation imported into an ancient context. A second problem emerged from archaeology, as excavations across the ancient Near East produced more and more documentary evidence from the second millennium BC. It became clear that many features of Genesis that the documentary hypothesis had dated to the first millennium. The patriarchal customs, the legal frameworks, the social structures fit comfortably within the second millennium context that a Mosaic authorship would require. The evidence of antiquity was showing up in the wrong place for the theory to work cleanly. Critics of Mosaic authorship have pointed to several passages in Genesis that appear to reference things that should not have existed in Moses' time. The mention of the Philistines in the patriarchal narratives, for example, has been used to argue that those sections must have been written after the Philistines arrived in Canaan. an event generally placed after Moses' death, references to the land of the Chaldeans, to certain place names, and to the presence of camels in contexts where archaeology supposedly does not support them, have all been offered as evidence of late composition. These objections deserve to be taken seriously rather than dismissed, but they also deserve to be examined carefully, because many of them weaken considerably under scrutiny. The Philistine question is representative. The large-scale Philistine presence in Canaan did begin after Moses. But the name Philistine applied to smaller earlier populations in the coastal and southern regions is not archaeologically impossible in the patriarchal period. Place names present a similar complexity. Later editors may have updated older geographical references with names current to their own time as a matter of clarity, without altering the historical content of the passages. This is a common scribal practice well attested in ancient literature, and it does not imply late authorship of the material itself. The camel question has received fresh attention in recent years. A widely cited 2014 study argued that domestic camels were not present in Canaan until the 10th century BC, which would make every Genesis reference to camels an anachronism. But the study was later critiqued for its limited scope and methodology, and other archaeologists have pointed to evidence of earlier camel domestication in the broader ancient Near East that the study did not account for. The case against Genesis on this point remains considerably less settled than early headlines suggested. While critics have used archaeology to challenge Genesis, the discipline has also produced findings that support the historical plausibility of its content in ways that would have been dismissed as naive in the 19th century. The city of Ur, identified in Genesis as the original home of Abraham, was excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934. What he found was not a minor settlement, but a sophisticated urban centre with extensive literacy, complex trade networks, and a level of material culture that fit precisely the kind of background the Genesis narrative implies for a family of Abraham's standing. The social customs described in the patriarchal narratives, the practice of adopting a servant as heir in the absence of children, the legal weight of oral deathbed blessings, the use of household gods as tokens of inheritance rights, have been confirmed by documents found at Nutsi and Mari, sites in Mesopotamia, whose archives date to the 2nd millennium BC and reflect a legal and social world that matches Genesis in striking detail. The Ebla tablets, discovered in Syria in the 1970s, contained references to cities mentioned in Genesis 14, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zor, in a sequence that matches the biblical order. These tablets date to approximately 2300 BC, placing the existence of these cities squarely within the time frame. Genesis implies for the patriarchal period, the discovery did not prove every detail of the Genesis account, but it demonstrated that the geographical and urban landscape the text describes was not a late invention. It was rooted in a real world. The academic mainstream shifted away from strong Mosaic authorship in the 19th century and has not fully returned, but a significant and growing number of careful scholars working across Old Testament studies, archaeology, and ancient Near Eastern history have maintained or returned to a conservative position, and their reasons are substantive rather than merely confessional. Kenneth Kitchen, one of the most respected Egyptologists of the 20th century, spent decades arguing that the structure, language, legal forms, and social customs of the Pentateuch reflect a Bronze Age composition environment, not the Iron Age context that the documentary hypothesis assumed. His analysis of treaty forms and covenant structures in the Torah demonstrated that they match 2nd Millennium Hittite treaty patterns precisely. Patterns that had fallen out of use before the first millennium. If someone had composed those texts in the post-exilic period, as the documentary hypothesis required, they would have needed to archaeologically reconstruct a legal idiom that was no longer in use. That is an implausible scenario. John Sailhamer, Dwayne Garrett, and others have argued on literary grounds that Genesis exhibits the kind of thematic and structural unity that characterizes single-author composition, rather than editorial patchwork. The recurring use of the Toldot structure, the consistent theological vocabulary, the coherent movement of the narrative from creation to the family of Jacob. 4. These are features of a designed whole, not a compiled composite. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd discovered a series of clay jars in caves near the Dead Sea, northwest of the ancient site of Qumran. What those jars contained would become one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, as they came to be known, were portions of every book of the Old Testament except Esther, including multiple manuscripts of Genesis and the other books of Moses. The significance of this discovery for questions of textual integrity cannot be overstated. Before the scrolls were found, the oldest complete Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament dated to around AD 1000, the period of the Masoretic scribes who standardized the Hebrew text with painstaking care. Critics had long suggested that 1,000 years of copying could have introduced substantial changes, corruptions or additions that made the text we possess unreliable as a witness to its original form. The Dead Sea Scrolls pushed the manuscript evidence back by roughly 1,000 years, to approximately 250 BC for the earliest fragments. And when scholars compared those ancient manuscripts with the medieval Masoretic text, the degree of agreement was extraordinary. The Great Isaiah Scroll, the most complete biblical manuscript found at Qumran, proved to be nearly identical to the much later Masoretic version across its entire length, with only minor spelling variations and no significant doctrinal or historical alterations. The implication for Genesis is direct. If the text was that stable between 250 BC and AD 1000, there is no textual reason to assume it was radically different in the centuries before 250 BC. The scroll evidence supports the picture of a tradition that took extraordinary care with its texts and passed them forward with a fidelity that the wider ancient world rarely matched. Whatever Moses originally wrote, the chain of transmission that preserved it was not the unreliable game of telephone that skeptical accounts often assume. There is a reason the Bible begins where it begins. Genesis is not simply the oldest book in the collection. It is the book that makes every other book in the collection intelligible. Remove it, and the rest of Scripture loses the ground on which it stands. The opening chapters of Genesis establish the framework within which everything that follows must be understood. God exists before the world. He created it freely, by an act of sovereign will, without needing any pre-existing material to work with. The world he made was good, ordered, purposeful, full of creatures bearing his creative intention. Human beings occupy a singular place within that order, carrying the image of their Maker in a way nothing else in creation does. These are not incidental affirmations scattered across the narrative. They are the load-bearing walls of the entire biblical structure. When sin enters the story in Genesis 3, it does not appear as a philosophical abstraction. It enters through a specific act in a specific place, involving specific people, and its consequences are immediate, concrete, and far-reaching. The fracture between God and human beings, between human beings and one another, and between humanity and the natural world, all trace back to that moment. Every problem the rest of the Bible addresses, moral failure, death, exile, injustice, the groaning of creation, has its explanation in those early chapters. And the first whisper of redemption appears there too. Genesis 3:15, in which God speaks directly to the serpent and promises that the offspring of the woman will crush its head, has been read across centuries of Jewish and Christian interpretation as the earliest announcement of a coming deliverer. The New Testament writers understood it that way. Paul, writing to the church in Rome, closes his letter with a phrase that echoes it directly. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The thread that begins in a garden ends at a cross. And the beginning of that thread is Genesis. The stakes of this question are not theoretical. They are practical and personal in a way that touches the core of Christian belief. If Genesis is historically reliable, if the creation it describes was real, if the fall it narrates actually happened, if the God it portrays is the God who actually made the world, then the entire subsequent narrative of Scripture makes coherent sense. Human beings need redemption because something genuinely went wrong at the beginning. Jesus came to undo a real catastrophe, not to correct a mythological metaphor. The resurrection is the reversal of a death that entered the world through a historical event, not the symbolic resolution of an ancient story about human psychology. If Genesis is not reliable in any meaningful historical sense, those connections begin to loosen. Not all of them snap immediately, and thoughtful theologians have spent considerable effort arguing that Christian faith can survive a non-historical reading of the early chapters. But the cost is significant. An Adam who is not a real person means a fall that is not a real event. A fall that is not a real event means that sin requires a different explanation. A different explanation of sin produces a different understanding of what redemption is and what it accomplishes. The threads are more connected than they first appear, and pulling on one of them moves others. This is not an argument for intellectual cowardice, for believing something simply because the alternative is inconvenient. It is an argument for taking the evidence seriously. And as this video has shown, the evidence for treating Genesis as a historically grounded document, composed by a real author with real access to real information, is considerably more substantial than the popular skeptical narrative acknowledges. One of the more important things to hold on to at the end of this discussion is that the question of how Moses wrote Genesis does not require choosing between a human explanation and a divine one. The biblical model of inspiration does not present God as having bypassed Moses' humanity in order to produce a divine text. It presents God as having worked through that humanity, through Moses' education, his cultural formation, his access to ancient records, his years of solitude in the desert, and his extraordinary personal relationship with God, to produce something that was genuinely both. Moses brought real things to the task. He brought the scribal fluency he had developed in Egypt. He brought familiarity with ancient literary forms, with genealogical conventions, with the way cosmological questions were addressed in the written traditions of his world. He brought whatever oral and written records had been preserved within the community of his people. He brought 40 years of desert solitude that had shaped him into a man capable of sustained, serious intellectual and spiritual work. And God brought what Moses could not supply on his own: the knowledge of what happened before any human being existed, the authoritative interpretation of events that had been distorted or misremembered across generations, the theological precision that distinguished Israel's account of origins from every other account circulating in the ancient world. the superintending influence of his spirit that ensured what was written reflected not just Moses' best effort, but divine truth. The result was a book with two authors. One was a man formed by one of the most intellectually rigorous cultures in the ancient world, shaped further by years of solitude and direct communion with God. The other was the God who was present before the first word of the text was written, and before the first word of the world was spoken. The question this video began with: how Moses could have written about events he never witnessed, turns out to be a doorway rather than a dead end. Stepping through it leads not into confusion, but into a richer understanding of the text, the man who wrote it, and the God who inspired it. Moses was not guessing. He was not borrowing loosely from surrounding cultures and giving their stories a Hebrew coat of paint. He was a man of exceptional formation who had access to preserved traditions, who understood how to work with written sources, and who had entered into a quality of relationship with God that the Bible itself describes as unique in all of human history. What he wrote about the beginning of the world came to him through a combination of sources that, taken together, are more than sufficient to account for the content of Genesis. And one of those sources was the God who was actually there. That should not make Genesis feel remote or inaccessible. If anything, it should make it feel more immediate. Every page of that book was written by someone who had stood before a burning bush and heard his name called in the silence of a desert. What he recorded on those pages was not the product of religious imagination. It was the testimony of a man who had met the author of everything, and been trusted to write down what he was shown. If you made it this far, you are the kind of person this channel exists for. You do not settle for surface-level answers when the deeper ones are available. And the deeper ones, as this video has tried to show, are far more compelling than most people expect. Moses did not write Genesis in spite of not being there. He wrote it because of who he was, what he had access to, and who he walked with. The question that opened this video was never really a threat to the text. It was an invitation to understand it better. If this content added something to the way you read Scripture, consider subscribing so you do not miss what is coming next. There is a great deal more of this kind of material on the way. Stories, questions, and answers from the biblical world that most people never encounter. Share this video with someone who loves the Bible, or with someone who has honest questions about it. Either way, it belongs in their hands. God bless you, and we will see you in the next one.